Hey guys, in this video we're going to talk about ecosystem diversity and then talk about how energy flows through that ecosystem. So there are a couple of key terms we need to talk about when you are classifying or describing the diversity of an ecosystem. And the first is species richness. And species richness is the number of different species you find in a sampling area. This is different from the relative abundance, which is a proportion, and it's the proportion that you have of different species. So if you have more of one species, that relative abundance is going to be higher. And then there are kind of two classification of species in an ecosystem. You have a dominant species, which is the one that is the most abundant and typically has the highest biomass. And so typically with the dominant species, not all areas, but in most areas, that's going to be a producer because that's where you're going to find the highest biomass on that food chain or web. And then you also have a keystone species. And the keystone species is not the most abundant. However, it exerts a really high control over that ecosystem. If you were to remove a keystone species from an ecosystem, the effects would have major, or there would be major effects on organisms that eat it. So its predators and what does it prey on. So keystone species exert a major control over an ecosystem. And an example is the sea star Pisaster living in Washington, and they feed on mussels. And when we take those away, the mussel population increases and actually takes over everything else. And so that sea star Pisaster is actually a keystone species. When you're talking about control of a community, there are two models, if you will, or two ways of thinking about it. There's a bottom-up and a top-down control. The bottom-up control just means that organisms at the bottom are going to exert a control on everything above it. Meaning that anything that changes down here will have an effect up here. However, the opposite of that, anything that happens up here, according to this model, does not affect what's down here. And so to even further simplify it, producers exert a major effect on that community. And then you have your top-down control, which means that everything that happens at the top level, the tertiary consumer level, for example, will affect everything below it. So if there's any change in this top level, meaning that maybe if this number increases, then everything below it will decrease. And if this decreases, then everything below it will increase. So this exerts that strong control. It's not that one model is correct and the other is not. It's just that these are two different ways of thinking about how communities are structured. A few more terms: gross and net primary productivity. Gross primary productivity, or GPP, is the amount of light energy that is converted into chemical energy, and that's going to be through photosynthesis. This is different from the net primary productivity, which is your gross primary productivity minus the energy used by producers for respiration. And so remember that plants will actually do photosynthesis to create glucose, but then they take that glucose and they have to further break that down for energy. And so the net primary productivity is going to be that gross amount, which is the amount of light energy that's converted. However, not all of that goes into making energy. And so the net is going to be the difference between that and the energy used by producers for respiration. Moving on, you have food chains and food webs. Food chain is very linear. It shows the path of energy from one living thing to another. In case you don't know, notice the direction of the arrows. The arrows always point to the organism that is doing the consuming, so which way the energy is actually flowing. Decomposers are going to make up a huge role in these food chains because they actually break down some of the living organisms. And then you have food webs here, which are very circular, and they consist of multiple food chains interacting with each other. And so it's not as linear as you see in that food chain there. And then lastly, we have an ecological pyramid. This is showing the flow of energy from producers all the way up to top predators, essentially. And what's important about this energy pyramid is that from each trophic level, and a trophic level is each energy level, only 10% of the energy available is or only 10% of the energy here is available to the next trophic level. So for example, if you have 10,000 kilojoules, for example, of energy available here, then the next level is only going to have 1,000 and so forth. So energy gets smaller and smaller as you move up through this energy pyramid.